present our speaker today, who is Harpal Brar. I'm sure you all know him very well. And his topic is Soviet preparations for World War II, the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, and the Russo-Finnish War.
Thank you, comrade. Thank you for coming to this meeting. It's a very important topic, and there is a lot of falsification about this particular question. And although you have heard me say this many times, I'd like to start this meeting with a quotation from Engels because it's so appropriate and it's worth repeating, not once, but many times over. Engels, in his unfinished history of Ireland, had something to say which is appropriate not only at the time about Ireland and what the British ruling class thought of Ireland, but also the world around us and how it's presented by the imperialists and the bourgeoisie all over the world. Imperialists and the bourgeoisie all over the world. Engels said the bourgeoisie turns everything into a commodity, hence also the writing of history. It's a part of its being, of its condition of existence, to falsify all goods. It falsified the writing of history. And the best paid historiography is that which is best falsified for the purposes of the bourgeoisie. Now there's a tip for you from Engels. If you really want to make some money, falsify the history of the working class movement and you stand to make very good money. You become a celebrity overnight and you'll be appearing on television very often and there'll be lots of handsome fees to be paid. And not only is this true of what they say about the Soviet Union, but it's also true about what led to the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, what led to Soviet pacts with the Baltic States, and what led to the Soviet-Finnish War. I think before I deal with this question, I want to give you certain general views that were held by the Soviet Union on the then impending war, the Second World War, that is. The Soviet view was that war was product of imperialism. And as long as imperialism is not got rid of, war cannot be eliminated. All the same, it was the policy of the Soviet Union to work for peace because she needed peace, she wanted peace in order to be able to build her economy, socialist industrialization, collectivization, building of working class culture, building of the Soviet armed forces to defend herself, build her diplomatic ties to the rest of the world. And therefore she didn't want to be embroiled in the war. Secondly, it was the view of the Soviet Union that it wasn't up to her whether she wanted to be embroiled in the war or not. As they say, it takes two to make a clap. One hand cannot do that. Soviet Union on its own could not preserve the peace. It was also dependent on other states. And thirdly, if the war could not be avoided, the Soviet Union did not wish to be alone, being the target of either one of the most powerful imperialist states, which at that time was considered to be either Germany or Britain, or worse still, the combined might of all the imperialist states who hated the Soviet Union as the first socialist country, as the motherland of the working class and of the oppressed peoples of the world. It was the attempt of the Soviet Union. She should not find herself in that position. That being the case, the Soviet Union was in the business of actually exploiting the contradictions between the various imperialist states. And the Soviet Union divided these imperialist states into democratic imperialist states and non-democratic, i.e. fascist imperialist states. Now, a lot of people laugh and say, how can you have an imperialist state that's democratic? Imperialism is imperialism, but the form of rule can change. There is a difference between ruling through consent, through parliament, the hoax of elections and all the rest of it, and ruling by the stick and instituting naked fascistic dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, as happened, for example, in Italy, as happened in Germany, as it happened in Japan. There were genuine contradictions not because the democratic imperialist states didn't like fascism. In fact, there's plenty of evidence. They were very friendly with Hitler and Mussolini precisely because they were anti-communist and they could be used for either waging a war against the Soviet Union or suppressing the working class at home. They were democratic in the sense that the democratic imperialists, by historical coincidence, happened to be in possession of the largest number of colonies, spheres of influence, and avenues for investment of capital. Whereas the non-democrat states were really champing at the bit, trying to get hold of these, and they could only do that if they could deprive the present holders of their vast colonial possessions, their avenues of investment, and their spheres of influence. So there was a genuine contradiction. And they wanted to be able to do that. With a view to that, the Soviet Union actually approached the democratic states and said, well, the Hitlerites are wanting to wage a war. The Soviet Union did its best to actually get the democratic imperialist states to align with her and make an alliance which would be fighting together against any aggression if it came from the fascist states. But of course, the democratic states were much more keen, as indeed was German fascism, Italian fascism, and Japanese fascism, to put an end to the Soviet Union. On that, they were in agreement with each other. What they were not in agreement with was the democratic states simply wanted the Germans to march in the direction of the Soviet Union, to subdue her, or at the very least that the two sides would weaken themselves. And when they were sufficiently weakened, the democratic imperialist countries would come and say, boys, you don't do things like that. We are all in favor of peace. Now please stop fighting. In this way, they hope to eliminate not only the hated socialist Soviet Union, but a rival imperialist power which was threatening their own colonial possessions, their spheres of influence, their avenues for investment of capital. That's what it is. And this was well understood by the Soviet Union. It was well understood because the democratic imperialist states, instead of concluding such an agreement with the Soviet Union, went on to sign the Munich Agreement. That was done in the year of August 1938. I think it's August 38. I just want to give you the day. No, September 38. 30th of September 1938. Now, there's a lot of falsification in this country. The bourgeoisie says, well, everybody was not around and Britain alone held aloft the flag of fight against fascism in September 1939. And they will tell you that Britain was fighting against fascism. And they will then tell you Stalin treacherously signed the Soviet-German non-aggression pact 11 months later in August 1939. What they will not tell you is that a whole 11 months before that, the French Premier Daladier and the British Prime Minister Chamberlain had gone and signed the Munich Agreement in September 1938 with Mussolini and Hitler, under which they had handed over Czechoslovakia basically to the Germans. And this was understood by the Soviet Union because soon after the signing of the Munich Agreement, about 4 or 5 months later, was held the 18th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In his General Secretary's report on behalf of the Central Committee, Stalin, in the foreign policy section, among other things, dealt with this question of Munich Agreement. He said, these gentlemen have basically signed away Czechoslovakia as a down payment to encourage Germany to wage a war against the Soviet Union. And then they would hope that if the two countries were embroiled in the war, they would in the end come in the interest of peace and separate them when the parties were sufficiently weakened. And he said, cheap and easy, isn't it? But he said, please remember, now you're showing such a benign attitude towards fascism. If it came to a fight between you and the fascists, do not expect us, as you always do, to pull chestnuts out of fire for you. This speech was picked up, obviously, very carefully by the Hitlerites in Germany. And soon after the Party Congress, they started approaching the Soviet Union, literally begging the Soviet Union to receive Foreign Minister of Germany, Ribbentrop, in the Kremlin. And he was received. And an agreement was signed. This is not a treaty of friendship. It's not an alliance. It's a non-aggression pact. Soviet Union had no problem signing non-aggression pact with anybody. She had signed non-aggression pact with lots of countries. Soviet Union did not wish to commit any aggression. Therefore, it was to the advantage of the Soviet Union to have a non-aggression pact, if in the end it would mean nothing for the imperialist powers, but at least they lose the moral ground that they've broken the pact and started waging a war. She signed the non-aggression pact. When that pact was signed, not only the imperialist bourgeoisie, because the game was up for them, cried foul, so many left-wingers, so many laborites, and even some communists, weak-hearted communists, felt very bad and resigned their membership of the communist parties. They could not understand it. They could not think out of the box. The Soviet Union had to think out of the box for the simple reason she was put in the position of responsibility, A, to defend the socialist system in the Soviet Union, and B, Soviet Union acting as a base for world revolution, as a base for the world proletariat, had a responsibility towards everybody else. Now, once that pact was signed, Hitlerites felt they were freed from the constraint of Soviet Union and the Western countries joining together. So literally days after this agreement was signed, a month later or so, on the 1st of September, the Hitlerites who had committed aggression in other countries before that, Austria, etc., marched their forces into Poland. Once they marched their forces into Poland, Poland was in the sphere of influence of the British and the French. It was clear to the British and the French that Hitler could not be, if you like, appeased. Something had to be done. So they gave an ultimatum to Germany to withdraw her forces from Poland. 48-hour notice. 48 hours came and went. Of course, Hitlerites had no intention of accepting this ultimatum in the sense of withdrawing their forces. So 2 days later, on the 3rd of September, Britain declared war on Poland. So
Poland?
They declared war on Germany. Now, the countries who'd been wanting Germany to wage a war against the Soviet Union suddenly found themselves. They had to wage a war against Germany. So the Soviet Union was able to turn the tables on them. That's why they'll never forgive the Soviet Union. That's why they'll never forgive Stalin. Stalin becomes the villain of the piece when Stalin is simply turning the tables on them and saying, no, we do not want a war with Germany. We do not want a war with anybody. If you want a war, you go and fight the war. And that's precisely what happened. In signing this agreement and getting the Hitlerites and the British to fight in that war, the Soviet Union was hoping not to avoid the war, but to gain valuable time. The Soviet Union, as it was, gained the time between 3rd of September 1939 to 21st of June 1941 when Soviet Union was attacked. Not long enough, but sufficiently long for the Soviet Union to have used that interval to make further preparations for her defenses, not only in Western Europe, towards Western Europe, but also in the Baltic, to which I shall come later on. If the Soviet Union made any mistake, the mistake was they had imagined that in the fight against Hitlerites, France will give a very good account of herself. Well, the French were invaded on the 10th of May 1940 by German forces, which actually as a part of a much larger invasion invaded also Holland and Belgium. The French were supposed to have the Maginot Line, allegedly impregnable, that nobody could actually defeat the French. But as a matter of fact, within less than 6 weeks, France had collapsed. And part of the reason was the Germans, in finding themselves in a difficult position, got themselves fighting what they call a blitzkrieg, a lightning war, mobile warfare, which actually worked. And secondly, the French bourgeoisie was divided. Although the French ruling class are very happy to talk about the First World War, they are very cagey about the Second World War because half of them were collaborating with the Nazis. They established the Vichy Republic. They were collaborators. The only people who were fighting against the fascists were the communists who organized the underground resistance, and then the sections of the bourgeoisie who joined that resistance as well. So because the French collapsed, once the French had collapsed, then the question was, the Hitlerites had to decide whether then to invade Britain or the Soviet Union. I don't have to give you an answer to this question. They invaded the Soviet. The Soviet Union got valuable time before she had to fight that war. So the Hitler-Stalin Pact that was signed is a part of the preparations for the Second World War, as well as an attempt by the Soviet Union that she would not be on her own in fighting that war. If she could not avoid the war, which she was pretty sure she could not avoid, she should not be on her own. And certainly the imperialist powers should not be fighting unitedly against the Soviet Union. And it's really part of the same efforts. And people will tell you, and this is often heard from the Trotskyite sections, Stalin trusted Hitler. Stalin didn't believe Hitler would attack the Soviet Union. What jokers are they? Stalin didn't believe that Hitler would attack them. Like Hitler was some very nice, loving cousin from Australia who'd come after a long while and he was very glad to meet you. Not at all. Every action of the Soviet Union shows that they didn't trust one whit any of the imperialist powers, particularly Germany, because Germany had made it openly clear that they hated the Bolsheviks, they hated this Red Menace, and that was their selling point to other imperialist powers as well. So the Soviet Union had to defend herself in the Baltic as well. There are 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And if you look at the map, they happen to be facing the Gulf of Finland, just under Finland. Estonia is the northernmost, Latvia is in the middle, and Lithuania is at the bottom of it. Well, these 3 Baltic states lie on the eastern shore of the Baltic. Latvia is the largest in territory, and Lithuania is the largest in population. Estonia, on the other hand, is the smallest in area and in population, but it guards the Gulf of Finland, which, of course, provides the approach straight to, well, we shall call Petersburg now, but Leningrad at the time. Leningrad was very, very close to these places, barely 30, 40 kilometers from Estonia. Now, during the First World War, all the 3 Baltic states were occupied by German armies. And knowing their deep hatred of the Germans, the Tsar had formed the Baltic regiments, which of course played a very honorable role from their point of view in the First World War. They fought well, and a lot of the Baltic soldiers were decorated by the Tsarist regime. Now, then comes the October Revolution on 7th of November 1917. And the October Revolution brings socialism not only to Russia, but a lot of surrounding areas as well. Soviet republics were set up in the Baltic states as well, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Then come the Germans again, and they defeat the Russian armies, and the Soviet Union, or rather the Soviet Russia, signs the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with the Germans. And this is from a point of weakness, because the Soviet forces were in no position to fight the Germans. And of course, the Germans straight away restored bourgeois governments in these areas. This territory was taken away from the Soviet Union. Then Germany herself collapsed. Germany lost the war, and there were revolutionary movements within Germany itself. And following the collapse of Germany, Soviet republics were again established in the Baltic. And then what should happen? With the German help, the Allies then restored bourgeois governments in the Baltic republics again. And then, for the first time, they said, these are independent republics. In fact, they didn't even recognize the independence of these republics. They simply wanted to use their territory for the purposes of having a jumping off point to attack Soviet Russia. In fact, the Soviet Russia was the first country to recognize them as independent states, and that was done in 1920 when Soviet Russia signed a peace treaty with them. Now, since they were set up as independent governments, I cannot go into the past history of the Baltic states, but basically they were ruled by Germans. Germans have been invading this area since the 13th century, and the German feudal lords, they were called German barons. They were ruling this area, and of course the local population, who was treated very badly by them, hated them very much. So when these independent states were established following the defeat of Germany, these governments took certain progressive measures, like the land basically belonged to 200 German families in this area. They took this land away from them and gave it to the local peasantry. But although these independent republics were established, being bourgeois, they still hated Soviet Russia more than anything else. Now, these states really cannot survive, or at that time certainly could not survive without having economic relations with Russia. Because whatever they produced, there had to be the market for them, and that market was in Russia. And these states hated Soviet Russia so much that instead of actually prospering by having trade relations with Soviet Russia, they stopped most of the trade relations. And the result was that they became backwaters. Latvia, for example, was industrially quite developed before the October Revolution. It was not an agricultural country, and it was soon turned into an agricultural country because the ruling class would have nothing to do with Soviet Russia. Move fast forward, there comes the Depression of the 30s, which shook the whole of the capitalist world to its foundations, including the Baltic republics. And under those conditions, there was a lot of turbulence, there was a lot of resistance by the working class against these rulers in the Baltic states. So they went on then to get rid of any democratic institution. And all these little states established fascistic dictatorships. Lithuania did it earlier than others in 1926. Estonia and Latvia did it in 1934. And these three states, along with Finland, became really bases for imperialist aggression against the Soviet Union. In 1939, on the 15th of March, German forces marched into Czechoslovakia. And they not only took over Czechoslovakia, but they taught a lesson to a lot of small states, including the Baltic states. And the Baltic states were left in the position where they had no defense against Germany or anybody else. Taking advantage of the fact that Germany was busy in the war with Britain and France, the Soviet Union, through Andrei Zhadanov, made a statement and said, we wish to, and I like to give you this quotation, we wish to live in peace with Baltic peoples, but if these tiny countries allow big adventurers to use their territories for big adventurers, we shall widen our little window on Europe with the help of the Red Army. Little window refers to Leningrad, and it simply means that the Red Army will have to take action in order to prevent these countries from becoming the jumping off points for aggression against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union then, as I said, taking advantage of the war between Britain on one hand and Germany on the other hand, proposed that these agreements, that the Baltic states signed with the Soviet Union pacts of mutual assistance. In the circumstances in which they found themselves, the Baltic states were given the proposal that they could not refuse. A, they wanted to defend themselves, and B, if they refused to have this agreement, the Soviet Union would have gone along anyway, and it would be perfectly justified if the Soviet Union wanted to defend her borders and safeguard her borders. But these Baltic states agreed, and therefore pacts of mutual assistance were signed between the Soviet Union and these states. These pacts of mutual assistance are almost identical, not completely, but almost identical, in the sense that they provide that the contracting parties would help each other in the case of aggression against each other or in the case of menace of aggression against each other, be it from the sea, be it through the land borders. Secondly, that they will not conclude any such alliances with a third party. And thirdly, that there would be trade agreements between them, which were very, very favorable to the Baltic republics, because they could then send their goods to the Soviet Union and also use the Soviet Union as a transit for sending goods to other places. These were the three specific parts of these agreements. But on top of that, the Soviet Union, of course, was granted bases in these areas. I first deal with the Soviet Pact of Mutual Assistance with Estonia. This was signed in September 1939, as indeed were the other agreements with the other Baltic republics also did that. And the provisions of the agreements were as I've told you what they were. But what's important about the Estonian Pact is that it granted the Soviet Union the right to maintain naval bases and several aerodromes for aviation on lease at reasonable terms on the Estonian islands of Ossau. You have to look at the map to find out. And Dago, or I don't know if the pronunciation is right, D-A-G-O with the umlaut on it, and the town of Peldiski. They were important for the Soviet Union to have in order to safeguard herself against any possible aggression, or any probable aggression rather. Then you have a similar agreement with the Latvian Republic. Again, the terms are exactly I have said, but what they said on top of that was that the Soviet Union secured the right to maintain naval bases in the towns of Libava and Vindava and several aerodromes, as well as, of course, a trade agreement. And even the Telegraph had to write in the following terms: "So perish the fervent Nazi dreams of Baltic domination. They hate the forfeit, but must stomach it." What could Germany do, embroiled as she was in a war with Britain? So they had to accept the fact that this is taking place. Because the Germans have always wanted to dominate the Baltic. It's a very, very long history. And Hitlerites, far from being the exception, were the fervent believers that the Baltic Sea was a German lake and they had the right to operate just as they would like to. And the Soviet Union, by concluding these agreements and having naval bases there, and under these agreements, small number of Soviet Red Army people and Red Navy people went into these areas. Be it said that in no way the Soviet Union either interfered with the system of government or state structures in these countries or social system. They could carry on as they like. All that the Soviet Union wanted to do was to prevent these countries from becoming bases for aggression against the Soviet Union. Another magazine in October 1939 in London called the News Chronicle said, "In the first round of war since the occupation of Poland, Germany had suffered a major defeat in the Baltic. It has always been a substantial element in German strategy to dominate the Baltic. Now it is dominated by Soviet Russia." So it was clear to the bourgeoisie what exactly the purpose of these agreements were. So people who tell you that Stalin did not make preparations for the aggression that took place subsequently in the summer of 1941 are talking nonsense. What do you think these agreements of mutual assistance with the Baltic states and the stationing of Soviet forces in these countries concerned with? It was mainly concerned with that no imperialist country should be able to use these places as a jumping off point for attack on the Soviet Union, particularly Germany. These republics were very close to Germany than to any other country, and that's what these agreements did. As far as the pact with Lithuania is concerned, it's very similar to other pacts. But one of the things it did, which pleased the Lithuanians no end, was that when Hitlerites had invaded Poland, and after a couple of weeks the Polish state collapsed, the Polish government ran away. The Polish general staff basically ran away as well. Once that had happened, the Soviet Union then occupied Western Poland and restored that territory to the Soviet Union, which had been the recognized international border before it had been taken away, before that territory had been taken away by the Poles in the war after the October Revolution. Poles proved stronger, Soviets proved weaker, and they took a lot of territory which normally would have been part of old Ukraine. This is called the Curzon Line, I believe. It was an internationally recognized border. So the Soviet Union took over those areas, thus securing herself to a certain extent in the West. And when they did that, then the Poles in 1920 not only had taken Western Ukraine and occupied it, they had also taken the capital of Lithuania, ancient capital of Lithuania, Vilna. So the Soviet Union, in this treaty with Lithuania, restored Vilna to the Lithuanians. And you can see the boundless joy. It's like somebody had taken London from us for 20 years. And then somebody comes along and says, that London is yours. I'm sure the Londoners would be very, very happy. And the Lithuanians were overjoyed by the fact that at long last, after 20 years interval, Vilna had been restored to them. Now that's something that irks the Poles very much, but there's nothing that they can do. They cannot disturb the international border now. So if there was anybody who was genuinely friendly to the Baltic republics, it was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was not going around to occupy these countries. She was going there in order to protect herself, to prevent these small states, who even if they had actually genuinely wanted to defend themselves against foreign aggression by imperialism, they were not in a position to do that. They needed somebody strong to defend themselves as well, their own sovereignty as well. And it was the Soviet Union that was in a position to do that. When Vilna was restored, this is a description given in the Times of 12th of October 1939. It said that the ceding of Vilna to Lithuania evoked unexampled enthusiasm in Kaunas. That was the town that was used as a capital after the loss of Vilna in 1920. With schools closed and houses adorned with flags, with strangers kissing each other and dancing in the streets. Old people capering like children, forgetting their age and infirmities. I wish I was there to forget about my age and infirmities. And so that is what these pacts were. Of course, once these pacts had been signed, there was one gap in Soviet defenses which could not be filled unless and until a similar agreement of mutual assistance, a pact of mutual assistance, was signed between the USSR and Finland. Because Finland provided the best territory for an attack on Russia. For the best approach to Leningrad is from the Baltic, and the shortest and the easiest route is through Finland, whose frontiers are only 35 miles distant from Leningrad. Finland is the key to Leningrad, and Leningrad is the key to Moscow. That is what the Times had written in 1919. But geography hadn't changed between 1919 and 1939. So the same would apply then. So quite rightly, the Soviet Union was doing its best to make sure that these places were not occupied by Germany. So with a view to forging a similar pact with Finland, the Soviet Union approached Finland and asked for certain facilities. And one of the main things it was that the northern border should be shifted about 25 miles away from where it was then. So that Leningrad would not be within the range of the then existing artillery shells technology. Because from the Finnish border, Leningrad could literally be shelled by the guns that were available at that time. Now, of course, the guns have undergone, unlike the geography, tremendous technological change. Because not only was Leningrad threatened by this close border, so was the route to Murmansk and Kronstadt. And the Soviet Union wanted the borders shifted. As a result of this suggestion, number of meetings were held between Soviet representatives and Finnish representatives in Moscow between 12th of October and 9th of November 1939. In all, 8 meetings were held. And the Soviet Union proposed that the Soviet-Finnish border on the Isthmus of Karelia, part of the Karelia was in Soviet Russia, and part of it was in Finland, be shifted several dozen kilometers further to the north. In exchange for this, the Soviet Union proposed to transfer to Finland a part of Soviet Karelia, twice the size of the territory that Finland was asked to transfer to the Soviet Union. So it wasn't a grab for territory. Soviet Union was prepared to give twice as much territory. It was just a question of having a strategic position so as to be able to defend ourselves against anyone trying to use Finland for attacking Leningrad. Further, the Soviet Union requested that Finland lease to the USSR on definite term a small section of our territory near the entrance to the Gulf of Finland, the port of Hango, for establishment of a naval base. With a naval base at the southern entrance to the Gulf of Finland in Baltiski, as per the Soviet-Estonian agreement, and a northern one at Hango, Soviet defenses would be very much strengthened. And they would serve to protect the Gulf of Finland against any hostile attempt on the part of other states. And of course, they would also strengthen the security of Finland herself. But Finland had been very much under the influence of the Germans. Germans had paid tremendous attention to and given a lot of assistance to this Finnish government to strengthen her defenses and to prepare her as a jumping off ground for attacking the Soviet Union. They had helped them build what is known as the Mannerheim Line. It's named after a Finnish general, Karl von Mannerheim, a fascistic character, very anti-Soviet, very pro-German. And this line was apparently considered to be even more impregnable than the Maginot Line in France and the Western Wall in Germany. Finland had 150 or some planes, but she had built an airbase that could house 2,000 planes. They were obviously expecting some nice guests to come and use that. Now, who would at that time have 2,000 planes? Germany? Even Britain didn't have 2,000 planes at the beginning. The Finns maintained that it was unnecessary to sign such an agreement because in view of the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, there was no threat from Germany. Well, you know all these pacts. You know what their value is as far as imperialism is concerned. Pacts are not meant to be kept by them. Pacts are only convenient for a certain period of time, and they're meant to be broken. like all their promises, and therefore the Soviet Union couldn't go along with that. And secondly, they said that really the acceptance of the Soviet proposals would mean that Finnish neutrality would be violated. Well, from the behavior they were guilty of, Finland could hardly be accused of being a neutral state. Nominally it was neutral, but in practical terms it was really a pawn in the hands of one or the other imperialist power. Now, then these negotiations broke down. The Finnish representatives went back to Finland. Then things started moving rather very quickly. On 26th of November 1939, a provocation took place at 3:45 in the afternoon. The Finnish side suddenly opened fire. You know the old saying, whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. Why would Finland do that against the Soviet Union? You can only see that somebody's egging them on. They opened fire against Soviet troops. 7 shells were fired, in which 4 Red Army men were killed and 7 wounded. While resolutely protesting against the incident, the Soviet government demanded that Finland withdraw its troops without delay 20 to 25 kilometers further from the border on the Karelian Isthmus, thus preventing the possibility of repeated provocations. The Finnish side replied 2 days later. And first of all, they denied that the firing had taken place from their side of the border. And then, almost mocking the victims of that incident, said it was probably a result of exercises by the Red Army in Soviet territory itself. In other words, they had staged the incident, or they were just incompetent and they killed their own people through these mismanaged exercises. And then they said they would only withdraw their forces 25 kilometers away from the border if the Soviet Union would do the same. And what would be the result of it? The Red Army would be taken away from the border to literally the environments of Leningrad. But the Soviet Union could not do that. In view of that, on 28th of November, the Soviet Union denounced the non-aggression pact with Finland, which had been signed in the 30s, and considered itself free from obligations and writ. And as soon as the Soviet Union had denounced the non-aggression pact, Mannerheim in Sweden ordered the mobilization of the Finnish forces. And on the same day, the USSR broke off relations with the Finnish government. After this, hostilities started on a larger scale between the two sides. So the two sides then basically are fighting with each other. So this war is generally considered to have been fought at the beginning of December and 13th of March, when the peace treaty was signed between Finland and the USSR. Meanwhile, on the 1st of December, literally as the war is starting, a provisional people's government was formed in the town of Terijoki, which is in Finland. And this was formed and led by a very well-known Swedish revolutionary. I don't know whether his name is not as famous. Tom would know that, and Ivor Cannon would know it. Kuusinen. At the time, the imperialist press even spread the rumors that he'd been arrested, tried, and executed, only to emerge as the leader of the Karelian Soviet Socialist Republic a few days later on. Now, the government that had been formed in the town of Terijoki supported the actions of the Red Army on the Finnish territory and thanked the USSR for its invaluable assistance for the purpose of eliminating soon, by joint efforts, the most dangerous seat of war created in Finland by the criminal government of war provocateurs. The People's Government vowed to overthrow the government of the Finnish White Guards. The Soviet Union straightaway recognized the Terijoki People's Government as the government of Finland on the 2nd of September 1939, concluded it with it the Mutual Assistance Pact, exactly the same that it would have wanted to conclude with the government of White Guards, if you like, but as you know, the negotiations broke down because of their refusal to sign such a pact, whereby the two sides undertook to assist each other, including militarily. Thereafter, the Soviet government maintained that the Red Army operations in Finland were merely in fulfillment of the terms of the mutual assistance agreement with the Teriyaki government. And remember, the Soviet Union could hardly have any designs on Swedish independence. Who was it who granted independence? Not Swedish, I mean Finnish. Who was it who granted independence to Finland? The Soviet Union. Who was it who handed the document of independence to the Swedes? Stalin. Finnish, sorry. Stalin. And so Soviet Union, having granted independence, wasn't out to destroy Finland's independence. It wasn't out actually to even change its social system. They didn't want to interfere with that. All they wanted was that Finland not allow its territory to be used for the purpose of an attack on the Soviet Union. Now, when as I have made perfectly clear before, and I repeat it again, the purpose of Soviet actions, military action in Finland, was to eliminate the danger of Sweden becoming, I don't know the French pronunciation, place d'armes. Finland, sorry, I keep on mixing. To prevent Finland from becoming a place for attacking the Soviet Union. Now, before you consider this very intense campaign, it was a very fierce war, you have to remember that in terms of area, Finland is quite large, 150,000 square miles. Not quite as big as Poland, but not very far short of it. It has 6,000 lakes, many rivers, marshes, rocky ranges covered with forests. Although its population was very small, at the time 3.8 million, it nevertheless mustered mobilization of 600,000. Its official army was only 30,000, but they had all sorts of other militias. They had even a rich ladies' force of about 80,000. And I mention rich because their hatred of Bolshevism was, to play a very important part. These are the kind of women who would go around, as Lenin said, who would gouge the eyes out of the dying Bolsheviks with the end of their umbrellas, right? So their hatred was part of it. Now, Soviet Red Army mobilized 600,000 people to fight. Now, military experts tell me, I'm not a military expert, in fact, I know hardly anything about military affairs, that you need a superiority of at least 2 to 1, if not more than that, against a country against which you are waging war. But Soviet Union had mobilized 600,000. The Swedes had done the same. So it was not... Finland had done the same. I got a death wish. Finland had mobilized 600,000. So the whole idea that this bully was coming to intimidate a child is just not true. And of course, Finland had been supplied with weapons by all the imperialist powers, including Britain, Germany, and France. When the war started, the imperialist propaganda, and I really concentrate on the British one rather than the American or the French, etc., they tried to spread every possible rumor about the Soviet campaign. It was regular to find in the newspapers in this country that since the war started, the morale and physique of the Red Army were very low. Now, this is far from the truth. The Soviet soldiers, although they were facing a very difficult fight, were not low in morale in any way. And certainly their physique was not deteriorated. Secondly, that the leadership of the Red Army was hopeless. And that's it. That's it. Constant canard. This was done also about the Second World War. the leadership was hopeless, that its equipment was antiquated. And so you had all these reports from our war correspondents who had never been near the war front in Finland, let alone witnessed a war. If for no other reason, Finland did not allow any correspondents to come within closer than 50 miles from the place of fighting. So the war correspondents were nothing more than, as Coates, who wrote a very good book about, he and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Coates, wrote a book, Zelda Coates. He was, his name was William Pater, I think. Coates. As they say, the typewriter generals. I think we got a modern name for these people. So they were writing these reports, sending them sometimes from the Swedish capital, sometimes from Stockholm, sometimes from Oslo, and these were war correspondents. They sat in bars, wrote reports, whatever their masters wanted them to write, and they wrote them.
Internet warriors, you're thinking of?
Internet warriors, yeah. At those days, of course, we didn't have internet, so they were typewriter warriors, generals. Further, it was said that there had been partial revolts which broke out in the Red Army, with hundreds of arrests in Leningrad and throughout Ukraine. That the Soviet Union, thanks to the campaign in Finland, had become dispirited and demoralized. That the Soviet Union was threatened by a bad harvest, when, as a matter of fact, 1940 harvest in the Soviet Union was the best in the country's history, not in the Soviet history, but in Russia's history. That the Red Army, in its advance, was using Finnish civilians as human shields, using men, women, and children before they advanced. We've had these. I mean, is there a modern ring to these reports?
There is.
You know, this is, of course, what Assad's army was supposed to be doing in Syria. So things do not change. And one of the things to remember is the Soviet campaign was not only denounced by the imperialist bourgeoisie, who knew better, but I mean, it's their job to defend their class interest. It was denounced by the labor leadership. It was denounced by so-called lefties, like you see in Stop the War Coalition today. You know, whenever there is an opportunity, they will denounce some third world country or the leadership of third world country rather than own ruling classes. I mean, the imperialist bourgeoisie only have to say Assad's forces have used chemical weapons, and Stop the War says yes, chemical weapons were used, without any investigation, without any proof. They go along with it. The bourgeoisie says jump, and their reply is how high, sir, and that's what they do. And so this is what was taking place in this country as well. Then, if that's not enough, that Stalin's health had deteriorated and he was suffering from lack of nervous power. Now, whatever you can accuse Stalin of, lack of nervous power is not something you will associate with this man of steel. Just when he was looking very fit and laughing heartily, watching a ballet performance at the Bolshoi Opera in Moscow, accompanied by Marshal Voroshilov, the Soviet defense minister, Molotov, the Commissar of Foreign Affairs, and many other Soviet leaders. Now, while these doomsday stories were being spread about the demoralization of the Soviet army, Stalin's health declining, Soviet forces revolting against their own generalship, Stalin's health deteriorating, while all this was going on, the Finnish army was on the verge of collapse. And it's only really when the peace treaty was signed and announced to the world, it was agreed that Finland had lost the war. Before they were saying, no way could the Russians defeat the Finnish army. Finnish army was some kind of a David fighting a Goliath, and of course David was bound to win. Nothing of the sort could happen. It was the first time in modern military history that a line like the Mannerheim line was frontally attacked and overwhelmed by the Red Army. This didn't happen between the French and the Germans. It didn't happen anywhere else. But the Soviet forces did that. When you look at the campaign, the Finnish Soviet campaign, there are a certain number of conclusions, certain deductions that come from it. I'm sorry, I'm having to shorten it because time will not allow for me to deal with everything. First of all, the Red Army's 600,000, pitted against an equal number of Finnish troops, showed a remarkable degree of fighting skill to be able to cope with that and win that war in the end. Secondly, the Soviet air assault did tremendous credit to the personnel of the Soviet Air Force and its methods and material. And there was a tremendous degree of coordination, which had to be very skillful in Finnish territory, between the land forces and the air force. Thirdly, the single railroad line feeding the 700-mile front functioned with precision because, supplying 600,000 people from the Soviet Union to the Finnish territory was not an easy job. Before the war and during the war, it was the bourgeois lie that Soviet railways were inefficient. They couldn't really do much, They didn't even know how to run timetable. Thank God there was Hitler to run the timetable in Germany. German trains ran rather well. But the Soviet Union showed a remarkable ability in regard to the functioning of its railroad system. Then the Red Army showed its flexibility in war. They had many plans. And when the actual wartime conditions demanded a change in tactics, they didn't say, we have taken a decision, we must follow it through. They changed their tactics accordingly in order to meet with the needs of war and with the needs of the terrain they were fighting in. They were able to overwhelm by sheer persistence, skillful fighting, ingenuity, valor and courage. The Soviet forces even learned how to ski. I mean, it was a general thing accepted in Europe. Finnish have been skiing for centuries. They know how to ski. It's in their blood. It's in their DNA. How could the Soviets learn to ski? Well, the Red Army did ski, and some fighting had to be done on skis. And they really proved themselves extremely good at that. While the imperialist press and radio, up to the last days of the war, were insistently claiming and maliciously claiming that disaster was befalling the Red Army north of the Lake Ladoga practically every day, the world was to learn after the war that the front was sufficiently stable to prevent the construction of 80-mile railroad line running from Petrozavodsk to Sudzhavy, the completion of which was announced to the Congress of Supreme Soviet by Andrei Zhadanov, thus bringing credit to the engineers of the Red Army. When the Soviet Union was waging war with Finland, it was generally said in the imperialist countries that Soviet aims were imperialist. And none was shouting themselves more hoarse than the labor and cooperative leadership in this country. The Soviet Union was an imperialist country. We always told you, it's not a democratic country, it's an imperialist country. They were quite happy with their own ruling class, subduing half the world's population. But when the Soviet Union actually fights for own defense, they were described as imperialists. Well, if they were imperialists, after the peace treaty, when the Finnish had lost that war, they would have demanded areas of Finland that were rich in resources. They would have demanded some booty. They would have demanded everything possible. No, they demanded simply to be allowed to station naval bases in certain areas and in certain ports for their defense. In fact, when they evacuated certain towns which were not the aim of that war, which they didn't want to take over, they made sure that everything in the place was in order. The equipment that had been damaged was put right. Even the streets were swept before the Red Army withdrew from them. I mean, the Red Army had impeccable credentials to say they were perfect gentlemen. Wherever they went, there was no molestation of women, which is so normal with imperialist armies. You know, the first thing you do is you find women, you molest them. When as I'll mention later very briefly, when the Germans came back, when they attacked the Soviet Union, came back to the Baltics, that's what they did. They took away a lot of women from the Baltic States, took them to Berlin, put them in soldiers' brothels, and they had with red-hot iron branded on their arms, soldiers' woman. You know, that's what they do. You know, this is how they show their imperialist chauvinism. There was no molestation of women. Women felt safe. There's one incident where, I don't know whether it's Latvia or Lithuania, a soldier helps a woman and says, "Please, mother, come here." He said, although women don't like being called mothers because it shows their age, she was so pleased that somebody will treat her with courtesy and regard for her. They gave concerts. These places had become cultural deserts. The Soviet army brought concerts. They sometimes brought the best-known artists in the Soviet Union, from Bolshoi, from Kirov, etc., to actually give concerts. And when the concerts were over, there would be dances where Soviet soldiers and local people would join in those dances. So a lot of fun and camaraderie was had by everybody around. And so the Soviet Union, far from claiming any territory, it simply wanted to defend itself. And the whole idea that Soviet Union was out to destroy Finland's independence, that the Soviet Union was out to destroy Finland's independence, was nothing but a barefaced lie. They even went further, that Finland would only be the first stop for the Red Army. They will then move to Norway and Sweden and take over those countries as well. As the negotiations between Finland and of course the Foreign Office had got a fairly good idea these were taking place, although they were hiding from the public that these negotiations were taking place, because the public persona is Finnish forces are fighting very well. There's no chance of the Soviet Union winning against it. These negotiations were taking place. France and Britain did everything possible in their power to offer more aid to the Finnish so that they should carry on the fight. But of course, the Finnish knew the reality that their army would not be able to carry on anymore. It was on the verge of collapse. So they refused to accept any further aid. And eventually, the peace treaty was signed in Moscow on the 13th of March, 1940. Britain gave a lot of help to the Finns. It sent over 100 planes, over 114 guns, 185,000 shells, 400 mines, and huge number of other material. When in fact Britain really was not that well equipped. Britain needed the material herself, but she sent it all the same to these. Now that's
don't forget Major Hooper.
No, I'm coming to it.
So this was in 1939?
The war took place from December 1939 to March 1940. And on March 1940, the peace treaty was signed between the two.
Basically, while Britain was at war with Germany.
Yeah. I mean, they while they were at war with Germany, they very nearly went to war against the Soviet Union over Finland. This is what Major A.S. Hooper was to write in October 1941. That is after Soviet Union had been attacked by the Germans. And it's a quotation which literally, in my view, sums up the entire situation well. A military training needs to look for deeds, and to eye with suspicion flood of oratory with which politicians regale the people. But such is the ruthless logic of events that it needs no military training to see today that the guns defending Leningrad are the bulwark of Britain, and our Waterloo of today is being won on the working fields of Soviet Russia. Who would have foreseen this in March 1940, some 18 months ago, when we were only stopped from sending 100,000 troops to right Russia and Finland by the sudden collapse of the Finns under the Red Army blows? It didn't take place, but they seriously considered sending an expeditionary force of 100,000 to Finland to fight on the side of the Finns against Soviet Russia. And that is the view of a respectable person who had been a major in the British Army, Major A.S. Hooper. Now, I brought you this far. Then, this is the final part. In the summer of 1940, having conquered France, Hitler turned his attention to the east, concentrating 80,000 stormtroopers disguised as tourists and 200 airplanes on the border of Lithuania. The USSR, taking note of these developments, demanded that her Baltic allies admit larger army forces to fortify their common frontier. And basically, within hours after having demanded, the Soviet forces basically swept through these territories. So whereas under the mutual pacts, a small number of Soviet soldiers were stationed in the Baltic republics, a larger number came in the summer of 1940, again in order to prevent these areas becoming outposts for German aggression. When the Soviet forces marched in, instead of being treated as occupiers, huge number of people came and greeted them with joy. A lot of progressive people, intellectuals, communists, trade unionists who had been jailed for nearly 20 years in these republics, in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, were freed from jail. And within a month of the Soviet forces going, all these countries held free, open, democratic elections. And as you can, it's very difficult for you to imagine when you look at Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania today, you know, it's not possible. I mean, they're run by basically Nazis now, right? But at that time, it was a completely different situation. People were actually enamored of what was taking place in the Soviet Union. I mean, countries like Latvia had close relations with Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and the old Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. You only have to read the proceedings and minutes of the Second Congress of the RSDLP, you know, how many Lets were there, how many Lithuanians were there. So these people elected governments which were very progressive. And these governments have been elected, and the old governments being got rid of. Many of them simply fled. They really fled to Germany, the leadership, the general staff, they all fled to Germany. And within a month of them being elected, they applied for admission into the USSR. And they were accepted into the USSR, so they became Soviet Socialist Republics in the summer of 1940. Sadly, there was not much time for them to develop a great deal further, because on 22nd of June 1941, Germany launched its attack on the USSR and put an end to that. And they would not be freed from that, the Baltic republics, until, of course, the end of the war, when they became part of the Soviet Union. They no longer are part of Russia now, because since the collapse of the Soviet Union, these countries have again become independent republics. And whereas before they were a jumping point for aggression against Leningrad, now these countries are occupied by NATO, principally by US imperialism, and they have become a point for a jumping off to invade Russia disintegrate present-day Russia. That's what they have become. That's what the dialectics of history have brought us to. So all I can say in the end is that whatever the Soviet Union did during that period was all designed to protect Soviet borders, was all designed to prevent these areas surrounding the Soviet Union, be it Western Ukraine, be it the Baltic republics, be it Finland. They were designed to prevent them from being used as basis for committing aggression against the Soviet Union. In the end, Nazi assault was so huge, these defenses did not prove completely capable of preventing German aggression. But they certainly delayed, and the German forces had to spend much more effort and time to reach other areas of the Soviet Union. In modern warfare, few days can make a lot of difference, and the Soviet Union certainly gained from these. And when the war actually did start, again, it was the expectation, probably hope in some circles, imperialist circles, the Soviet Union would collapse. And the Soviet Union was given basically 6 weeks to survive. 6 weeks became 6 months. 6 months became 4 years. And despite the horrendous losses she suffered and the sacrifices she made, the Soviet Union came out victorious. Now, if you read the books today and if you ask an average person in New York or Washington or London who fought against the Nazis and who saved us from the Nazi Holocaust, they will tell you America or Britain. Some even will say France. Some even will say France, right? But it is because the Soviet Union has collapsed. And there's no one on our side to tell the truth to the world. That's why, small though this meeting is, it's so important to assert the truth. Sometimes the truth is asserted by a minority, but it doesn't cease to be the truth just because it's asserted by a minority. We got to keep on repeating. Galileo fashion, we got to say, it goes around.